Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, let's learn. That's what we usually do here. My name's Connor, if you're new. Preemptive like. History with Hilbert. Great channel. So, everyone hears about Henry VIII. I want to learn about other English monarchs. I think Henry VII is a good start, so let's learn. Let's go.
To Henry VII, and this time Hello everyone and welcome back to Henry VII, and this time I'm going to be looking at Henry VII's reign in 10 minutes time. This being because a lot of people will be sitting their A-level exams soon, and I thought this would be a nice way to help them to prepare for this, as a lot of people have been asking
A-level exams?
me to do. This would be a nice way to help them to prepare for this, as a lot of people have been asking me to do this. Now I do have other videos on Henry VII, so check the cards and the
like SAT?
description below during this video if you want to look at more in-depth looks, and I'll try and make some more as well in the future. So without further ado, let's get this video underway. So first, the consolidation of power. So of course the prelude to the reign of Henry VII is the Wars of the Roses, which were fought from 1455 to 1485 and essentially were a civil war between various factions, both vying for power: the House of York of the White Rose and the House of Lancaster with the Red Rose. Now Henry had a weak claim. He was a Lancastrian through his mother's side, through Margaret Beaufort.
So is Henry VIII the first monarch post War of the Roses?
And Henry had a weak claim. He was a Lancastrian through his mother's side, through Margaret Beaufort, and therefore he could become king. Now he invaded England in 1485 when Richard III was on the throne, with help from both France and Brittany.
Jesus Christ, I was not ready to learn. Ready to learn.
Beaufort, and therefore he could become king. Now he invaded England in 1485 when Richard III was on the throne, with help from both France and Brittany. And at the Battle of Bosworth, Richard III tried to charge his household cavalry, his household guard, but was intercepted by a third army at this battle by the Stanley brothers, by William and Thomas Stanley, and they helped him to defeat Richard III. They killed Richard III, and this meant that Henry VII was now king of England. So actually the day before...
Just fast forward if you want, guys. And Brittany defeated King Richard III after his charge on his household guard and was intercepted by the Stanley brothers.
His household guard, but was intercepted by a third army at this battle by the Stanley brothers, by William and Thomas Stanley, and they helped him to defeat Richard III. They killed Richard III, and this meant that Henry VII was now king of England. So actually the day before the Battle of Bosworth, on the 21st of August, he crowns himself king. Then on the 30th of October, he is crowned, of course, officially crowned. It's his coronation in Westminster. Then on the 7th of November, he summons Parliament for the first time, and on the 18th of January 1486, he marries Elizabeth of York, and she obviously soon gives birth to a son, their first son, Arthur Tudor. The reason...
Well, all that happened in 1485, very, very quick. 1486 for here.
She obviously soon gives birth to a son, their first son, Arthur Tudor. The reason he summons Parliament after he's crowned king is to show that he won the crown through right of conquest, as well as obviously marrying Elizabeth of York meant that they cemented the two houses of York and Lancaster that had been fighting for the last 30 years together in an attempt of unity. Now let's move on to some government policy. Now Henry was actually, as quoted by Ronald Hutton, said he was interested in the aspects of government that bored most other monarchs. He would sit through all the paperwork and all the boring stuff that most other monarchs found really boring. So for example, his son Henry VIII, in a style of government known as the chamber style of government, a close group of advisors, and he essentially oversaw everything. Now he greatly diminished the power of the nobility, because the nobility had small groups of retainers, essentially small armies during the Wars of the Roses, which they used to fight each other, and he essentially weakened the nobility by using things like bonds and recognizances, which was where he'd essentially give them a huge loan, and if they misbehaved, he would obviously pull the stops and say, right, I want the money back, and they wouldn't be able to pay. As well as organizations such as the Court of Star Chamber, which was set up to deal with petty crime and things, and also to charge the nobles with ancient laws, as well as the Council Learned in Law, headed by Empson and Dudley and Bray and others. Parliament met 7 times during his reign, and pretty much all the times that Parliament met, except for the first one, which was to obviously declare him king, was to raise extraordinary revenue in the case of war.
Sorry, I had to switch my fan.
obviously declare him king was to raise extraordinary revenue in the case of war. Now, his economic policies, he set up the council that Parliament met, Bray and others. Parliament met 7 times during his reign, and pretty much all the times that Parliament met, except for the first one, which was to obviously declare him king, was to raise extraordinary revenue in the case of war. Now, his economic policies, he set up the Council Learned in Law, as explained before, headed by figures like Empson, Dudley and Bray, who usually came from the sort of middling class, the gentry class, so these people were often hated by the nobility, and this was to financially control the nobility. Now, bonds and recognizances, again, were these bonds that were signed, and the nobles essentially recognized that they had this amount of money from the king and they would have to pay up if they broke their will. And as well as this, obviously the retaining mentioned before, he forced everyone to have a retaining license. So Lord Burgovanny, for instance, he was fined an obscene amount of money because he had too many retainers, and Henry wanted to control the nobility, as well as financial gain from military successes. So after the Cornish rebellions in 1497, he didn't kill everyone, he taxed the rebels. They had to pay a fine, as well as the Treaty of Etaples with the French. The French had to pay a large amount of money after that as well. Now let's move on to some foreign relations. So really in his time, he owed debts to both France and Brittany because they had both helped him to come to power with supplying troops for the Battle of Bosworth, and he signed the Treaty of Rhode in 1489 with the Bretons, and this essentially led to the Breton crisis of 1489 to 1492 because Henry wanted to stop the rising power of France in Europe, and he essentially sent troops first covertly and then openly invaded in 1491 to support the Bretons against the French. Now as well, there were trade embargoes with Burgundy because in Burgundy, Margaret of Burgundy was ruling, and she was the sister of Richard III and supported Yorkist pretenders like Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel, as well as being in conflict with Scotland to the north, which was an independent nation, because they also supported the Yorkist pretender Perkin Warbeck, although this was resolved in 1497 with the Treaty of Ayton, followed by the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, which didn't really last that long, as well as then marriage alliances, which were important for continuing the succession and the dynasty, because these would obviously...
So at first consolidating power within the British Isles, within Britain, or Britain, within the British Isles, and now the foreign policy being to make sure that lands in France couldn't rise up against them anymore.
Help safeguards, which were important for continuing the succession and the dynasty, because these would obviously help safeguard the new Tudor dynasty in their position. So the Treaty of Medina del Campo in 1489 was a marriage, or essentially arranged the marriage, they were still toddlers at this point, between Arthur, so Henry VII's son, and Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen who essentially united what would become the modern kingdom of Spain.
So Arthur was a brother of the future King Henry VIII?
As well, there was the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, which I've just mentioned in 1502 with the Scots, which was the marriage, or the arranged marriage again, between Margaret Tudor, so the daughter of Henry VII, and James IV of Scotland, who was going to become the king and who would later on be killed at the Battle of Flodden. So how about the social issues during this period? Well, there were quite a few rebellions, and all the rebellions apart from 2 were caused by the Yorkists, who were trying to retake the throne for a member of the House of York. So in 1486 you had the Lovell Rising, I believe with then Lord Lovell, Francis Lovell.
So the marriage between Henry VII and a Yorkish woman didn't necessarily calm fully the rivalry between the Yorks and Lancasters.
Being 6, you had the Lovell Rising, I believe with then Lord Lovell, Francis Lovell being involved, although this fell apart fairly quickly. This was more a conspiracy. In 1487 there was a big rising with Lambert Simnel, who claimed to be one of the princes in the Tower, one of the sons of the earlier Yorkist king Edward IV, with then the Earl of Lincoln becoming involved, the de la Poles. That the Earl of Lincoln was John de la Pole, the eldest de la Pole brother, although this was defeated at the Battle of Stoke. In 1489 there was the Yorkshire Rising, and this one actually was not caused by Yorkist pretenders. This was caused by the taxation that was forced upon the people to deal with the Breton crisis, which they had to pay for 2,000 troops being sent over. In 1495, Perkin Warbeck tried to invade Lancashire, although this failed very badly and he was forced back. In 1496, Perkin Warbeck again invaded from Scotland. He had Scottish support, although the Scottish troops soon pulled back when English reinforcements came to the north. In 1497, the First Cornish Rising was actually in some way indirectly caused by Perkin Warbeck, although they rebelled again because they were forced to pay taxes, which they didn't like paying because the Cornish had been exempt due to them being a mining region, and they rebelled and actually came to the suburbs of London, where they were defeated by German mercenaries at the Battle of Blackheath.
Question. So were the people of Brittany and the Cornish within, like, on good terms?
Now in 1497 there was a second Cornish Rising when Perkin Warbeck attempted to manipulate the ill feeling of the Cornishmen against the London and the Henry VII's administration, although when the English, the Royal Army, approached Perkin Warbeck and the Cornish army, he fled and the rebellion fell apart. Now as well, during this time people had the highest real wages and buying power out of any Tudor period, so people were essentially the best off economically, and Henry did a lot to stimulate the economy, especially with trade and exploration, with people like John Cabot going to faraway places like Newfoundland where fisheries were popping up. There was also, of course, the main trade during this period was with Antwerpen and the Burgundians with the cloth trade. Obviously in England there were a lot of sheep, and they then obviously got the wool and used this to make it into cloth, which they did in the Netherlands during this period. And the people were incredibly strong.
They made wool into cloth? I thought cloth was like a linen.
Only Catholic. This
wool cloth,
which they did in the Netherlands during this period, and the people were incredibly strongly Catholic. This was much before the obviously the Reformation that went on in Europe a bit later on, although there were some changing ideas, some humanist ideas being brought forth by figures like Erasmus, who did actually come over to England and visited various places. There were certain movements of change, although really England was still quite conservative in its Catholic belief, as well as the bishops being changed up a little bit by Henry VII, like Cardinal John Morton, for instance, who was the head of his spy network. There were church figures being used for more political gain during this time. Now, if we look at the timeline, these are 5 points that I've selected that I think are very useful points for sort of benchmarking Henry VII's reign. So first, 1485, of course, is the start of Henry's reign after the Battle of Bosworth, which was fought on the 22nd of August, 1485. 1489 is an important year because that's the year of the Yorkshire Rebellion, and if you know that the Yorkshire Rebellion occurred in this year, it was caused by the taxes, the extraordinary revenue, which was sparked by the Breton crisis because Henry had promised in the Treaty of Rhode of the same year to pay for a 6,000 strong army, so he obviously had to pay for that. 1497 is the height of the Perkin Warbeck conspiracy. Henry had promised in the Treaty of Rhode of the same year to pay for a 6,000 strong army, so he obviously had to pay for that. 1497 is the height of the Perkin Warbeck conspiracy. There were two rebellions in Cornwall, one being caused by having to pay off the Scottish army that invaded the year before, and the other one being capitulated on by Perkin Warbeck, of course leading to his capture, finally. In 1503 there was the death of Elizabeth of York, and she actually died a year after her firstborn son, Prince Arthur, and this was obviously a huge turning point for Henry VII because two of the closest people, his successor, so it made the dynasty a lot weaker, and his wife, who they really did love each other, so this was a really big blow to him. She died, and obviously in 1509 Henry himself dies. Alright everyone, so I hope you have enjoyed this video. Thanks again to the Patreons who are making it possible for me to sit around and make this video.
Ooh, part 2?
I hope you have enjoyed it, and if you'd like to know anything else, just leave some comments in the comment section below, and I'll try and pop up another video very soon about Henry VIII and then through the other monarchs.
Ooh, I'd like to see both of these.
So thank you for watching. I've been History with Hilbert, and this has been the 10-minute history of Henry VII. What is going on, everyone? I'm History with Hilbert, and this is part 2 in my series on the first Tudor monarch, Henry VII. Now, in today's episode, I'm going to be taking a look at the consolidation of power from 1485 to 1500. Hope you all enjoy. So first of all, let's quickly look at what happened in the last episode, which was the Battle of Bosworth, in which Richard III, the last Yorkist king, the last Plantagenet king, was killed at the Battle of Bosworth, and when Henry VII became King of England. Although this is of course just the start of his very interesting story. Now of course after the battle, this is the start of the Tudor dynasty, and this is where we get the Tudor monarchs because of his victory there. And in today's episode, as I said, we're going to be looking at...
Okay, so Henry VII is the first king following the War of the Roses, where he still had to consolidate power. Okay, and the start of the Tudors.
What came next in his story. So of course the initial aftermath of Bosworth is that they have all these Yorkist prisoners, because not everyone was killed. In fact, not a very large amount of people was actually killed at Bosworth in comparison to other battles of the time. Lots of people just surrendered after Richard had been killed. And remember, if you haven't seen that video, this video might not make too much sense, so I'll leave it in the description below if you want to go and watch part 1 before you start on here. So actually something that's important to note is that the Battle of Bosworth took place on the 22nd of August 1485. However, Henry VII had himself crowned king the day before, on the 21st of August. This may seem a bit odd, but there is actually a very good reason for this. That being that anyone who then fought against him at the Battle of Bosworth the day after, on the 22nd of August, this meant that they were all traitors to the crown, because Henry could then smugly say after the Battle of Bosworth, well, hold on a minute, I was already king for a day, so anyone fighting against me was a traitor. And this meant he could do pretty much anything he wanted against them, because that's the way things worked back in the Middle Ages. Of course, it's a bit cheeky, but really it worked because he was king, and this was actually a viable option for him to take, which is why he did it in the first place.
Right.
Now, on the 30th of October 1485, this is when his official coronation happens. So there is a slight difference in between when someone can claim to be king and when someone is crowned, and when someone is actually officially recognized by sort of the church and the state as well as being
De facto to de jure.
king. And this official coronation in London then happened on the 30th of October. Now, it's important that he did this before calling Parliament on the 7th of November, which was also needed to become king in essence. And the reason he does this is to show that he doesn't need Parliament to be king. His whole idea of how he became king, and which really he did, was through winning the Battle of Bosworth, not because he's reliant on anyone else. And this will be important later on about why he chooses to marry after becoming king as well, because he wants to show that he did this by himself. He did this through right of conquest, not right of Parliament or right of marrying someone from the other royal family at the time in England. So on the 7th of December, November, he calls Parliament after his coronation. Now, of course, he had a lot of enemy nobility who...
Right, so he was, through conquest, the de facto leader of England, but now he seeks de jure recognition from these people
he captured after the Battle of Bosworth. And I'm just going to take a look at all of them now, all the important ones, and what he did there, because this is obviously important for consolidation of power, because the nobility in this period were the ones who could levy troops, levy retainers, and this is essentially what happened during the Wars of the Roses. So these were essentially people who could command mini armies, so he had to choose how he would deal with these people in order to stop the Wars of the Roses happening again. So the first one here is Henry Percy, the Duke of Northumberland. Now, he was in command of part of Richard's army at Bosworth, but he didn't actually commit his troops to the battle, which directly resulted in Richard's defeat. Now, I actually talked about this in the previous one, about whether he could have committed his troops, or he didn't want to, or he was physically stopped. We're not entirely sure. But anyway, his father had been a loyal Lancastrian who had been killed at the very bloody Battle of Towton in 1461. Also, I'd like to point out that in the previous video, I mixed up Towton and Tewkesbury. Tewkesbury, I hope I haven't mixed it up again actually. I'm pretty sure Towton was in 1461 and Tewkesbury was in 1471. I think I've got it the right way around here. But he then swore fealty to Edward IV and the Yorkists in 1469. So he's not from a traditionally Yorkist family. However, he did hold important Yorkist positions in northern England. Now, the verdict for him was that he was imprisoned until 1486, although after that, after he has proved his loyalty, he was restored to his northern titles, and he was actually implemented in going on missions for the crown, which does show that Henry actually placed a considerable amount of trust in this guy. Now, the next person was John de la Pole Jr., who was the Earl of Lincoln. Now, he was Richard III's nephew, and crucially, he was also the heir. Richard III did have a son, but this son died, and after he died, he named this guy, his nephew, the heir to the crown. So obviously, he is a potential claimant and a rallying point for Yorkist resistance. Spoilers. So he also swore loyalty to King Henry after Bosworth, and he didn't actually get sent to prison. Now, this is possibly to show that Henry was willing to forgive people on the other side of the Wars of the Roses, which had been one reason why it kept going, and he was actually invited to join the council after some period of time. Now, next up is actually his father, who is John de la Pole Sr., who is the Duke of Suffolk. Now, he was married to Elizabeth of York, so he was the brother-in-law of Edward IV and Richard III. Quick clarification there are several Elizabeth of York during this period, so that's actually the, let me get this right, the grandmother of the Elizabeth of York, who I'm going to mention in the later on in this video, but it is.
Wow, so isn't Edward V the father of Queen Elizabeth II? And so that was a long time from Edward IV to an Edward V, if I'm not mistaken.
Is a bit confusing. He wasn't actually very involved in the Wars of the Roses, though he was politically aligned to the House of York through marriage, obviously because of his marriage to Elizabeth of York, which is then why his son, John de la Pole Jr., is the nephew of Richard III, because Elizabeth of York is Richard III's...
Oh my god, I'm doing my best to follow.
Jr. is the nephew of Richard III, because Elizabeth of York is Richard III's sister, I think. It's rather confusing, but they are connected by marriage, but essentially he wasn't that involved. And he also professed loyalty to the king, and because of this, Henry thought, well, he didn't really do much in the Wars of the Roses. He's probably not going to be a rallying point for Yorkist sympathy, so he was allowed to keep all of his lands and his titles. Again, it's the idea of the carrot and stick policy. Now, that does have a few meanings, I'm aware, although one way you can use that term is to look at the carrot is essentially when you're trying to when you're being nice to people, when you're trying to win them over by currying favor, and the stick is when you're beating someone with a stick, so you're trying to beat them into submission. So here he is showing much more carrot than stick, because essentially it's more effective sometimes to just leave people alone and then they will leave you alone. Now, this next one is Thomas Howard.
I always thought that the term the carrot and the stick was like a carrot on a stick, so that like you could just lead someone into something you want. But it seems like the stick is used in this as like more violent suppression.
Who was the Earl of Surrey. Now, this next one is Thomas Howard, who was the Earl of Surrey, and he was the one who led Richard's troops at Bosworth, alongside his father, who was the Duke of Norfolk, and he was actually killed during the battle, his father, so there might be cause for some revenge there, which is why Henry treats him slightly differently. He also supported Richard's usurpation of the throne, because of course, after the first Yorkist king died, who was Edward IV, he had sons, the two sons, Richard and Edward, and they were both the princes who were the famous princes in the Tower. Now, there is some debate about whether Richard killed them or whether someone else, came, found them, and then, chucked them in the river or something like that. But he's definitely blamed.
They were the two that were found later, like in the Tower of London in the basement or something.
For came, found them, and then chucked them in the river or something like that. But he's definitely blamed for it, and Richard actually usurped the throne in 1483. However, there was a split in the Yorkist faction at this point, and there were those who did not like the fact that Richard had usurped the throne and wanted to help the princes in the Tower. They thought they were the rightful claimants to the throne, and this was called Buckingham's Rebellion. However, this guy Thomas Howard had fought against Buckingham's rebels, many of whom, after the failure of this rebellion, went over the channel to help Henry in his bid for the throne. So what happened to him? He was given an Act of Attainder, which is an important term.
God damn it.
For the throne. So what happened to him? He was given an Act of Attainder, which is an important term for this period, which is essentially where all the titles and lands were stripped and they were exiled. And in 1487, actually, he does actually redeem this, because the Earl of Lincoln, spoiler alert, John de la Pole, who I've just mentioned, he actually revolts against Henry. Now, my next episode is going to be part 1 of the rebellions. I've already decided to split it into 2 parts, because another spoiler alert, there are a lot of rebellions against Henry VII, but he's given a chance to escape from imprisonment. However, he refuses, so Henry thinks, wow, this guy is trying to show his loyalty. So in 1489 he is released and the Act of Attainder is reversed, essentially returning his lands to him. Now finally we have this guy who is the Earl of Warwick. He was 10 years old, and I believe I'm right in saying he was the nephew of Richard III, so also a very strong claimant to the throne, and he is just imprisoned in the Tower because that's just something that Henry doesn't want to burn his fingers with. So next up we obviously also have not just the people who fought against Henry, who would be expecting punishment, but those who fought for Henry, because obviously they were fighting for him for a reason, and he needed to...
Sounds strange, but like, why not just kill him if he's a threat to your right to the throne? My main thought is that because it would just give a bad impression and anger people more. But is putting them in jail forever really any better?
Support and reward his supporters. So first of all, we see that a lot of the more common guys fighting for him, or when I'm saying common I mean lesser nobility, were giving knighthoods and titles. So for instance, his uncle Jasper Tudor was given made the Lord Justice of Wales, as well as the Lieutenant of Ireland. His another of his friends, who was called Giles Daubeny, was initially a Yorkist, but he had fought against Richard III during Buckingham's Rebellion in 1483, was made Lord Chamberlain. Now there was also a guy, he was also made the Lord Lieutenant of Calais, which at that time was an English port town, obviously on the other side of the English Channel in northeastern France. And then we also have John Morton, who was also against Richard III's usurpation and also a former Yorkist. So it's interesting that he tries to balance between and make a distinction between the Yorkists who had been lifelong committed its usurpation and also a former Yorkist. So it's interesting that he tries to balance between and make a distinction between the Yorkists who had been lifelong committed Yorkists and allies of Richard III, and more original Yorkists who had been the allies of Edward IV. So it's quite a clever way that Henry sort of plays the Yorkist faction to try and win over support. But anyway, John Morton, he is made the Archbishop of Canterbury. So, of course, he inherits a country that is chronically divided. They had been at war since about the 1450s, arguably even earlier, and he needs to sort this out and unite everyone under one common rule, obviously his rule. He doesn't want the war to continue, he wants it to stop completely because now he is in power. So one way to do this is to symbolically do this, and of course the two signs that came to represent the two factions or groups of families during this period were the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster. And what he does is he combines these two to make the Tudor Rose, which was...
I'm so stupid. I thought it was the opposite.
Both red and white. And he started to...
Looks like an egg.
Put this symbol absolutely everywhere. If you look at government buildings from the period, you will see lots of Tudor roses. And actually, if you look at your 1 pence coin, if you are in the United Kingdom, you will see a portcullis. That portcullis is the Beaufort portcullis. Henry VII's mum was called Margaret Beaufort, and I believe, I'm not sure if the Tudor rose is on. Actually, I think it's on the 5p. I think it's on the 5p. Don't quote me on that. I'll have to have a look.
The Illuminati.
And of course, then later on, he needs to make a physical representation of the union of York and Lancaster like he did with the Rose. So what he does is he marries Elizabeth of York. This is the Elizabeth of York that was the daughter of King Edward IV, and she's very interesting because she is the daughter of the king, so when Edward IV was king, then she's also the sister of the king, who she was the sister of the princes in the Tower, who was also king at one point. Then she was also the niece of the king when Richard III became king, and when she married Henry VII on the 18th of January 1486, she became the wife of the king, a real turning point in the Wars of the Roses, because obviously now you have a claimant from the one side.
Seriously, after all that's happened in the last 30 years, you still thought roses were an appropriate flower choice for our wedding bouquet? We want this man's head on a plate.
Henry VII, marrying the daughter of the old Yorkist king. And this means that this is really a turning point in the period of the Wars of the Roses, that things are looking up. Real progress has been made in actually ending the Wars of the Roses, which was of course Henry VII's interest. Now, after they get married, they go on what's called a progress in March 1486, which is essentially where they go around the royal houses of the country. They go right the way up the north, right the way to York. Now, it's important why they go to York, because York was, of course, it's where the House of York gets its name, and also because that city, York, was actually a very pro-Richard III. Richard III did a lot of work in the north, which is why he is actually quite well known in the north, actually, in York. Things like that. There is a museum to Richard III. There's also a museum to Henry VII in York, actually, in some of the towers. But it also showed that the king was powerful. It's a way for the king to go out and to see his people, and more importantly, for the people to see the king. And this showed that he had real power if he is making progresses around the country, because his predecessors hadn't really dared to, as in the last Lancastrian kings. They made progresses much more closely around London, which was what most monarchs did. They hardly ever left the southeast. But this was a real progress up into the north of the country, which had not really been seen before. Now, as well, of course, they had to make a physical embodiment of the Tudor Rose. And on the 20th of September 1486, this was indeed accomplished, when Elizabeth of York gave birth to their first child, who they named Arthur, after the mythical prince from the Dark Ages. And of course, this was a huge deal for Henry, and of course for Elizabeth as well, that had a kid, which is great. But this was a big deal because they were the monarchs, and now they had someone to succeed them, which, you know, it would take a lot longer for his son Henry VIII to do. But that's for another video. So guys, this has been part 2 in Henry VII, who ruled England from 1485 to 1501. I hope you have indeed enjoyed this video. If you have, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. If you'd like to know anything more, just comment anything below. And if you could share it with a mate who might find this interesting, then I would really appreciate that as well. As well as then tuning in for the next episode, which I think I'm going to try and upload 2 of these episodes every month.
Great video. I've learned a lot. It was very confusing at points, but I know the War of the Roses, even for English students, is notoriously difficult to follow, so I guess I shouldn't feel too bad. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. If you're not doing well, chin up. Emotions are fickle, my friend. You'll be good soon. Don't worry. And I'd appreciate anything I said was incorrect. Call me out in the comments. Answering any of my questions. You guys are always awesome at that. I hope I'll see you for the next video. We keep on learning together. Bye, guys.